Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward, glad to share this quiet hour with you. Tell me, is there a lamp burning near you tonight? Perhaps a cup of something warm, particular stillness that comes when the day has finally finished its business. These are the hours in which old records speak, in which a single erased line in a parish register, carefully treated with acid and silence, can conceal 30 years of consequence. Watson understood this well. That what a man removes from the page reveals far more than what he leaves behind. Do subscribe to Watson's Margins so that none of these careful observations escape you. Now settle in. For, as Holmes knew, the truth does not disappear when it is hidden. It merely waits. You will find our Spotify channel, Watson's Margins, linked in the description below. The perfect companion for an evening such as Prowse This, Chapter 1, The Rectory at Blackthorn Vale. It is a peculiarity of my long association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes that the most singular of his cases have arrived, not in the ordinary manner of the detective's advertisement or the policeman's summons, but through the agency of private distress. A face drawn tight with anxiety, voice struggling to contain what the heart can no longer hold. Such was the manner in which the affair of the erased parish register first presented itself to us on a bitter November evening, when the fog pressed so heavily against the windows of our Baker Street rooms that the gas lamps in the street below were reduced to pale and sickly halos, and the world beyond our fire-lit sitting room seemed to have ceased to exist altogether. I had spent the afternoon reviewing my notes on a previous matter, and had fallen into something of a doze when Holmes, who had been silent at his chemical bench for the better part of 3 hours, spoke without turning his head. "We shall have a visitor before 7 o'clock, Watson," said he, "a clergyman, a man of some years, unaccustomed to distress of this kind, therefore rendered the more conspicuous by it." I roused myself and glanced at the window. "You have heard something on the stair?" "I have heard nothing. But I observed Mrs. Hudson's expression when she returned from the front door 20 minutes ago. She wore that particular look of compressed sympathy which she reserves for those in genuine trouble rather than mere inconvenience. She is an excellent barometer of human suffering. The clerical detail I deduce from a card she left upon the mantelpiece, though I confess in this instance I cheat somewhat, for it bears the name. I took up the card and read, "Reverend Septimus Hale, Rector, Parish of St. Michael and All Angels, Blackthorn Vale, Sussex." At a few minutes past 6 o'clock, Mrs. Hudson announced the Reverend Hale, and the gentleman who entered our room was precisely the figure one might conjure from those words. A tall, spare man of perhaps 65 years, white hair swept back from a broad forehead, and the patient, deliberate bearing of one long accustomed to the measured rhythms of country life. Yet his composure, I could see at once, was maintained with effort. His hands clasped before him as he crossed the threshold betrayed the faintest trembling, and his eyes moved quickly from Holmes to myself to the fire, and back again with the restlessness of a man who has passed a sleepless night or two in recent memory. Holmes rose and directed our visitor to the armchair nearest the hearth. "Sit down, Reverend Hale. Come from Sussex this afternoon." "Not this morning, I think. Or you would have been here sooner, croused. The matter has been weighing upon you for some days, and you debated whether to seek assistance at all." The clergyman settled into the chair and looked at Holmes with an expression in which wonder and relief were equally mixed. "You are right on every point, Mr. Holmes," said he. I am not, by temperament, a man who carries his troubles beyond his own parish. It goes against something in my nature to do so. But this business has grown beyond anything I am able to resolve through ordinary means. Then tell me of it, said Holmes, leaning back with his fingertips pressed together and his grey eyes half closed. What followed was a narrative that I shall attempt to set down as faithfully as my memory permits. For the quiet, troubled voice of that country clergyman carried within it the first faint notes of a chord which, when fully struck, proved both darker and more human than either Holmes or I had anticipated. The parish of Blackthorn Vale, the Reverend Hale explained, occupied a fold of the Sussex Downs, some 12 miles east of Horsham, a district of scattered farms, managed woodland, and the single great house of the neighbourhood, Blackthorn Hall, seat of the Brentwood family for generations past. The church of St. Michael was ancient, its register dating without interruption from the reign of George III, and Reverend Hale had served as its rector for the past 23 years. Some 10 days prior to his visit to Baker Street, he had been engaged in the reorganisation of the church archives. When he discovered, upon opening the register for the year 1878, that a page within it had been subjected to chemical treatment, a single entry on that page had been all but obliterated. The surrounding text remained perfectly legible, only one baptismal record, a brief entry of perhaps 4 lines, had been erased with considerable care, and the rector's subsequent inquiries established. With the application of oxalic acid, a substance not readily available to the casual vandal, nothing of any monetary value was connected to the register. No other page had been disturbed. Nothing had been stolen from the church. And yet, said Reverend Hale, when I made the discovery known to certain of my parishioners, the reaction was quite disproportionate to the act itself, or so I should have thought. In what manner disproportionate? Holmes asked. The rector hesitated. Man does when he wishes to be both truthful and charitable. Fear, he said at last. Not curiosity, not indignation, fear. Holmes opened his eyes fully at this. The principal figures of the district, as Reverend Hale described them, were few but well defined. Sir Lionel Brentwood, master of Blackthorn Hall, was a man of perhaps 70 years, long a pillar of the county, though lately much weakened by a complaint of the lungs which had kept him largely confined to his house. His daughter, Miss Clara Brentwood, managed the estate with quiet competence in her father's declining health, and was spoken of throughout the neighbourhood with universal respect. There was Mr. Adrian Mowbray, the family solicitor, who had offices in the nearby market town, and had overseen Sir Lionel's affairs for the past decade. There was Mrs. Edith Wren, long resident in the village, who had served as housekeeper to the rectory since the death of her husband some 15 years since. And there was Captain Julian Forsyth, lately returned from service in India, who had been calling at Blackthorn Hall with a frequency that left little doubt as to his intentions toward Miss Clara Brentwood. Each of them, said the rector, was present at the small gathering I convened in the vestry when I announced the discovery, and in each of them I observed something which I can only describe as the anxiety of a person to whom the news is not entirely surprising. Holmes rose from his chair and stood at the window, his hands clasped behind his back, gazing into the yellow fog. "The erased entry," said he quietly. "You have not been able to reconstruct its contents." "Only in the most fragmentary way," said Reverend Hale. "The acid has done its work thoroughly. I can make out nothing but the date. The 14th of March, 1878, and the single word baptism. Everything else is gone. Everything, Holmes repeated, with a slight emphasis that seemed to indicate the word interested him considerably. Was there, in or around that year, any occurrence of note within the parish? Any disruption of the ordinary tenor of village life? The clergyman was silent for a moment. When he spoke, voice was lower. There was a matter, never openly discussed, even at the time, concerning a young woman in service at Blackthorn Hall, governess. She left the district suddenly in the spring of that year, and was not heard of again. The circumstances were considered unfortunate. The subject was not pursued. Holmes turned from the window. "Watson," said he, "I think we must travel to Sussex." Psst. I had not expected so swift a resolution, and said as much. "We are not yet dealing with a crime," Holmes explained to Reverend Hale, noting my expression. "Or rather, we cannot be certain that we are. But the deliberate removal of a single name from a record kept for a century, and half, is a fact of some significance. Such acts are seldom prompted by idle mischief. When a man takes the trouble to erase the past, 'tis because the past has begun, in some way, to make its presence felt in the present. I should very much like to see this register, and the village which produced the anxiety you describe." We arranged to travel to Blackthorn Vale on the following morning, and the Reverend Hale departed with something of the weight visibly lifted from his shoulders. That relief which comes not from the resolution of a difficulty, but from its having been placed in capable hands. After he had gone, Holmes stood for a long while before the fire, pipe unlit in his hand, his gaze directed at no particular point. "Well, Holmes," said I, "what do you make of it?" "I make nothing of it yet," said he. "That is precisely what makes it interesting." He turned to me with that sudden sharpness of expression which I had long since learned to associate with a mind fully engaged. "A name removed after 30 years, Watson. Not a document destroyed, not a record stolen, merely a single name, surgically excised. Whatever that name meant to someone, it has begun to mean something again. What has changed, after 3 decades of silence, to make it dangerous once more?" I had no answer to offer him, and Holmes, relapsing into his customary stillness, offered none himself. The fog pressed close against the windows of Baker Street, and the fire burned low, and the November night settled about our lodgings with the patient weight of a season in no hurry to release its hold upon the world. Chapter 2. Shadows Beneath Respectability. We departed Victoria on the 8:15 the following morning, Holmes wrapped in his travelling coat, and already deep in a railway guide which he had obtained from the bookstall on the platform, though I strongly suspected he was reading nothing in it. The countryside beyond the carriage window shifted by degrees from the grey press of London, outer parishes, into the more open Surrey heathland, and by the time we crossed into Sussex, the fog of the previous evening had thinned to a cold, white haze that clung to the hollows and left the higher ground bare, and frost silvered beneath a pewter sky. Reverend Hale met us at the halt with a dog-cart, and we covered the remaining distance to Blackthorn Vale along lanes so narrow that the leafless hawthorn on either bank reached overhead like the arches of some dishevelled cloister. Holmes sat beside the rector on the box and put several questions to him, none of which touched directly upon the matter in hand. He asked about the history of the Brentwood tenancy, the character of the soil, the distance from the village to the hall, and the approximate age of the church. To any observer he might have been a country gentleman engaged in idle inquiry. I knew better than to interpret his silences as vacancy. The village of Blackthorn Vale revealed itself gradually around a bend in the lane, a short, high street of flint-faced cottages, a public house, a forge, and at the far end, set back behind a lich gate of weathered oak, the Church of St. Michael and All Angels. Its tower squared off against the sky, with the unmistakable solidity of Norman construction. Beyond the churchyard wall, the ground rose gently toward a line of beeches. Through their bare branches could be glimpsed the chimneys of Blackthorn Hall. Reverend Hale took us directly to the church. The interior was cool and smelled of stone and old candle wax and something else. A faint, acrid undertone which Holmes identified before I could form the thought. "Oxalic acid," he said quietly, pausing just inside the door. "Not fresh, not old either. A matter of weeks, I should say." He glanced at the rector. "You have not cleaned the register since the discovery?" "I have touched nothing," said Reverend Hale. The register was kept in the vestry, a narrow room off the north transept, its shelves lined with bound volumes of varying age and condition. The volume for the years 1875 to 1882 lay open upon the vestry table, weighted at its corners by two smooth river pebbles which the rector had placed there as a precaution against any further disturbance. Holmes bent over the open page without touching it, his lens produced from his breast pocket in a single fluid motion. I watched him work in the way I had observed 100 times, and never grown accustomed to. There is a quality to Holmes's concentration that is almost physical, a stillness so complete that it seems to alter the atmosphere of whatever room contains it. He moved the lens slowly across the surface of the damaged page, then tilted it to catch the pale light from the vestry's single small window, then held it horizontal to examine the texture of the paper itself. "The acid was applied with a fine brush," he said at last, straightening. "Not poured or daubed. You can see the limit of the treated area is too precise for anything less controlled. The hand that did this was not agitated. It was patient, paused, which tells us something about the character of the person, if not yet about their identity." He turned the volume carefully and examined the adjacent pages. The ink of the surrounding entries is unaffected. There are no accidental splashes, secondary marks. Whoever effaced this record knew precisely what they wished to remove, and removed nothing beyond it. This was not an act of frustration, Watson. It was an act of decision. We left the vestry and walked the short distance to Blackthorn Hall, Reverend Hale having arranged that Holmes and I should be received as his guests. The house presented a face of Georgian regularity, a broad, symmetrical front of pale brick, with sash windows that caught the thin light, and gave back nothing warmer. A butler of advanced years admitted us, and we were shown into a drawing room, furnished with the accumulated taste of several generations. Comfortable and handsome, without ostentation. It was some minutes before the household assembled, and those minutes were instructive. Miss Clara Brentwood entered first. The impression she made was immediately and decidedly favourable. She was a woman of perhaps 30 years, with a composed, intelligent face in which the marks of habitual self-command were visible to any careful observer. Post. She greeted Holmes and myself with a directness that suggested she was not in the habit of performing for strangers, and expressed her concern about the register with measured words that were, I thought, chosen with some care. "We are naturally anxious that the matter be resolved," said she. "It is distressing to think that someone has been within the church for such a purpose." Holmes thanked her for the sentiment and asked one or two mild questions about the history of the register, to which she replied without evident discomfort. But when Reverend Hale mentioned, in passing, that Holmes had examined the damaged entry in some detail, something crossed her face, quickly suppressed, and quickly gone. But there, nonetheless. I should not have called it guilt. I should have called it apprehension. Sir Lionel. Brentwood joined us shortly after. Tood, the old man, moved with the careful deliberateness of one for whom each set of stairs has become a negotiation. Pallor of chronic illness lay over his features like a thin wash. He was courteous, even gracious, offering Holmes a dry handshake and inquiring after the journey with the automatic hospitality of a man bred to the forms. But when Holmes, studied casualness, remarked that the erasure must have represented considerable trouble, for whoever was responsible, Sir Lionel's response struck me as singular. He said nothing. He looked briefly at his daughter, and then at the fire, and his expression was that of a man who has been told a thing he already knew, and had hoped, without real conviction, might never be said aloud. It was exhaustion, not anger, resignation, not innocence. Mr. Mowbray arrived from the market town in time for luncheon, well-made man in his middle 40s, whose manner suggested professional solidity, but whose eyes moved with a calculation that sat just slightly at odds with the candour of his greeting. He acknowledged the business of the register with the air of a man who considers it tiresome, and wishes it concluded, and turned the conversation more than once toward matters of estate management and village administration. Holmes allowed him to do so, listening with apparent idleness. Captain Forsyth, the last to appear, was a figure one could not easily overlook. He was a broad-shouldered man of 40 or thereabouts, with a soldier's bearing, a sun-darkened complexion that spoke the soak of years in southern climates. He greeted Holmes with the particular heartiness of a man making an effort, dismissed the question of the register almost before it had been raised. "Village superstition and small-town gossip," said he, with a laugh that was perhaps half a measure too confident. "Some local malcontent with a grievance against the church. That's all it will amount to, I'll wager." Holmes agreed with polite mildness, and I saw his eyes move once, briefly, precisely, to Captain Forsyth's hands. We dined that evening, at the rectory, and when we had retired and the house was still, I asked Holmes what he had made of the afternoon. He sat on the edge of his bed, his coat already removed, his gaze directed at the low ceiling, with the expression of a man sorting through a cabinet, ideas, and finding the arrangement unsatisfactory. "3 people in that drawing-room were afraid," said he. "Sir Lionel, Miss Brentwood, Forsyth, though the nature of the fear differs in each case. Mowbray is anxious, which is a different condition entirely. And Mrs. Wren served tea and did not speak. Was the most interesting of all. How so?" "Because she worked very hard to give the impression of not listening," said Holmes, "and thereby demonstrated that she heard every word." He reached for his pipe, and then set it aside. Was a long-forgotten scandal at the root of this, Watson, as Reverend Hale has already suggested. The forgotten scandal does not motivate a careful act of chemical erasure in the present day. Something has brought that old buried business. When I discover what that catalyst was, the rest will follow. Quiet for a moment. "A governess," he said, half to himself. "Gone in the spring of 1878, and not spoken of since. The house creaked around us in the wind, and outside the windowed the beechy trees of the hall moved against a sky from which every star had been extinguished. Chapter 3. Murder in the Vestry. I am not by any measure a man easily startled from his sleep. Years of military service in Afghanistan and a long subsequent association with Sherlock Holmes have between them accustomed me to disturbance at irregular hours, and I have learned to surface from sleep quickly and without confusion. Even so, the knocking that roused me at 6:30 on our second morning at Blackthorn Vale arrived with a quality of urgency that reached me before I was conscious of it, and I was at the door of my room before the sound had ceased. It was the rectory's young housemaid, white-faced and breathing rapidly. "Mr. Holmes, sir." "The Reverend," she managed. "In the church. They've found him." Holmes was already in the corridor behind me, fully dressed, which suggested either that he had risen early or had not slept at all. He asked the girl 2 sharp questions: who had found the body, and whether anyone had entered the vestry since, and had his answers before we reached the bottom of the stair. The churchyard in the early morning carried a desolate beauty that seemed, under the circumstances, an affront. The frost had settled overnight onto every stone and blade of grass, and the path to the church door was rimed white and crisp underfoot. Farmhand named Tupper, who served as the rector's odd-job man, stood at the lychgate gate with his cap in both hands, unable to speak with any coherence. Holmes put him aside gently, and we went in. Reverend Hale lay upon the vestry floor with the settled finality that admits no ambiguity. He had fallen backward from the direction of the shelves. Wound to the right side of his head was consistent, in my professional estimation, with a single forceful blow delivered by a blunt object of moderate weight. There was no sign of that object. He had been dead, I judged, for somewhere between 6 and 9 hours, which placed the hour of death in the late evening of the night before, a time when Holmes and I had been at supper scarcely 100 yards distant, and the church had stood, as far as anyone knew, locked and unattended. Holmes moved through the vestry with a care that seemed almost reverential, though I understood it to be something more precise than that. The respect of an intelligence for the integrity of evidence. He did not kneel beside the body immediately, but stood first at the threshold, turning his head by slow degrees, reading the room as a scholar reads a difficult text. The register volume remained on the vestry table, still weighted by the rector's river pebbles. Beside it lay a fragment of charred paper, roughly the size of a playing card, its edges consumed but its centre partially preserved. Holmes retrieved it with his handkerchief, examined it without expression, and placed it carefully within his notebook. "The same page?" I asked. "Portion torn from it at some point prior to last evening," said Holmes. "Whether by Hale himself, or by someone else, I cannot yet say, but the acid-treated surface is visible on this fragment, and it was burned in this room within the last 12 hours. The char marks on the flagstones tell us the burning took place upon the floor, not in the grate." I turned my attention back to the body, making such notes as a medical man must, while Holmes conducted his examination of the floor and the surrounding shelves with his lens was. It was during this interval that he called to me in a tone which indicated something of interest had presented itself. "Come and look at this, Watson. Do not walk to the left of the table." I approached from the right and crouched beside him. He was indicating a section of the flagstone floor some 3 feet from the vestry's inner wall, where the surface showed a faint smearing of reddish-brown clay. Not mud-tracked from outside, but the denser, more particular material of cultivated soil. There were no accompanying bootprints in any direction. The traces appeared to have been deposited, then partially disturbed, as as though someone had stood in one position and shifted their weight without moving across the floor. "Came in and stood here," said Holmes quietly. "They did not pace. They did not search. They waited, or they confronted." I looked toward the small window, set high in the vestry's north wall. Its iron latch was drawn shut. Outside, voices reached us. The village was waking to the news with that peculiar efficiency which attends catastrophe in small communities. And within the hour, Blackthorn Vale had acquired the concentrated attention of all its inhabitants. Holmes and I returned to the rectory, where breakfast that neither of us ate with any appetite. We received the members of the household one by one. Clara Brentwood came first, foot from the hall, and the change in her from the previous afternoon was marked. Careful composure of the day before had given way to something rawer. She was not weeping, but she sat with a rigidity that suggested weeping was being held at some cost. And when Holmes offered his condolences, she received them with a brevity that might have seemed cold in any other circumstances. "Reverend Hale was a good man," she said. And then, after a pause of several seconds, "He spoke to me yesterday evening, after you had gone. He said he wished to discuss something with me, something he had recently found. I told him tomorrow would suit, as it was growing late." She stopped. "You will reproach yourself for that," said Holmes, not unkindly. "I would ask you not to. The outcome would have been the same." She looked at him with an expression that contained, beneath the surface grief, a flash of something sharper. Not quite fear, but the recognition that she was in the presence of a man who already understood more than she had disclosed. Sir Lionel arrived from the hall shortly after, supported by his manservant, and the sight of him was affecting in a way that transcended the ordinary pity one feels for age and illness. He sat in Reverend Hale's own chair beside the cold hearth, and received the facts with a quietude that was, I thought, the quietude of a man who is suffering the confirmation of a fear he has carried. So long it has become indistinguishable from himself. He asked no questions. He offered no theories. He simply sat, and the silence around him was of the quality that surrounds a very old grief. Captain Forsyth came in from the lane at a near run, and the anger he brought with him was immediate and loud. He demanded to know what was being done, who had been questioned, why the village constable had not already dispatched to Horsham for the county police. His agitation had the surface appearance of righteous indignation, and perhaps a portion of it was genuine. But Holmes, who observed him throughout, with the patient attention he reserves for specimens of particular interest, caught my eye once across the room and gave the smallest shake of his head. The anger that slight gesture indicated was not primarily the anger of a man outraged by the death of a clergyman he had known. It was the anger of a man who has been overtaken by events he believed he had controlled. Mowbray, the solicitor, arrived at last, and was immediately, audibly, and with considerable conviction, guilty of being visibly nervous. He spoke too much, qualified everything, and mentioned twice, at apparent reason, that he had been at his office in town until after 9 o'clock the previous evening. Holmes thanked him for the information with a pleasantness that caused Mowbray to look briefly, as though he wished he had said nothing at all. By mid-morning, a telegram had been dispatched to Scotland Yard at Holmes's request. By early afternoon, the reply informed us that Inspector Lestrade would be joining us on the following morning's train. Holmes said nothing about this development, But I noticed that he spent the remainder of the afternoon not in the rectory or the church, but walking the grounds between Blackthorn Hall and the churchyard at a slow, contemplative pace, his hands behind his back, his gaze directed at the frozen earth. Once I saw him stop and examine the base of the conservatory wall at the eastern end of the hall with considerable attention, and once he paused at the churchyard gate and looked back toward the house with a stillness that lasted the better part of 2 minutes. When he returned to the rectory as the early dusk settled over the valley, his expression had acquired that particular quality of energized calm which I had learned to read as the sign of a mind that has added one piece to a picture it has not yet shown the world. "The clay, Watson," he said, removing his coat. "There is no clay of that composition within the churchyard or the lane. There is, however, quantity of it in the terracotta flower pots of the hall's conservatory." He paused. Someone walked a very short distance between 2 buildings and was careful about the door they used. Not careful enough. Chapter 4. Inspector Lestrade arrived on the 10:40 from Victoria, stepping from the carriage with the brisk, self-possessed air of a man who has travelled to the country to bring order to a situation which the country has proved unequal to managing for self. He was lean and dark-eyed as ever, his bowler hat set at its customary precise angle, and he shook Holmes's hand at the halt with the particular warmth of a colleague who knows, from long experience, that he will almost certainly disagree with everything Holmes says for the next several days, before ultimately conceding that Holmes was right. "Bad business," said Lestrade, surveying the lane and the frosted fields beyond, with the expression of a man confirming his pre-existing view of rural life. "Clergymen, too. They'll want this settled quickly." "They will want it settled correctly," Holmes replied. "Quickly would be a pleasant addition." Lestrade received this observation with the patience of long habit. We walked together to the rectory where Holmes laid before him, concisely and without embellishment, the facts of the case as established to that point, made several notes, and asked a number of questions, which, while competent, suggested his mind was already sorting the available figures into categories of likely and unlikely guilt. From the emphasis of his inquiries, it was clear that Adrian Mowbray had attracted his attention as a candidate worthy of early and serious consideration. This circumstance did not surprise me. Mowbray's barely concealed anxiety, his unprompted alibi, grim, and the rapid circulation of village gossip regarding his financial difficulties had combined to place him in a position of uncomfortable visibility, and Lestrade was experienced enough to recognise the type. What Holmes made of it I could not yet determine, for he spent the morning's conference largely in silence, speaking only when asked a direct question, and then with an economy that might have suggested indifference to anyone who did not know him well. After Lestrade had departed to conduct his interviews, Holmes asked me to accompany him back to the church. We had the vestry to ourselves. The body had been removed the previous afternoon, and the room had recovered something of its ordinary character, though the scored flagstones and the blank, weighted register on the table were reminders enough of what had occurred. Holmes went immediately to the table and stood over the damaged page. For a considerable time, his lens in his hand, but not yet raised. "I have been thinking," said he, "about the chemistry of memory. I waited. Oxalic acid removes iron gall ink by reducing the ferric compounds to ferrous salts, which are colourless. The words vanish, but the paper retains a ghost of them. In the slight depression of the nib strokes, in the differential absorption of moisture, in the residual compounds that a careful examination can still detect. He raised the lens at last and bent close to the page. Our obliterator knew this, or should have. Yet the work was done regardless, which suggests that the risk of a careful man reconstructing the entry seemed, to them, pressing than the risk of a casual reader encountering it intact. The obliteration was a precaution, not a concealment. Precisely, Watson. Caution against the uninitiated, not against the determined. He straightened and handed me the lens. Look at the lower third of the affected area, and tell me what you observe. I bent over the page with care. The treated surface had the dull, faintly iridescent quality of paper that has been wetted and dried unevenly, and at first I could distinguish nothing beyond the general blankness of it. Then, at the angle Holmes had indicated, I began to perceive what I can only describe as shadows. Not of ink remaining, the impressions made by a pen pressing upon the page above it in the bound volume. Adjacent pages, written upon with the ordinary firmness of a clerk's hand, had left faint ghost marks on the surface below. "There are letters," I said. "Fragments of letters. The entry above this one, which remains perfectly legible, written with sufficient pressure to leave impressions on the acid-treated page. Text of the entry above is not what interests us. It records the baptism of a farmer's child and is fully readable. What interests us are the impressions that bled through from that entry onto the erased one, where the ink has been removed. But the paper retains the physical memory of adjacent text. He produced, from his notebook, a sheet upon which he had already made a careful transcription of the fragmentary impressions put, and I read them with a growing sense that we were assembling something meaningful from very little. Phrase "male child" appeared with reasonable legibility. Below it, at an angle suggesting the line beneath, the words "mother unmarried," or perhaps "mother unmarried," were partially recoverable, and lower still, in what Holmes identified as the line traditionally reserved for the baptismal sponsor. 3 letters were clear. E.W. Holmes folded the sheet and replaced it. "E. Wren," said I. "The probability is strong. Mrs. Edith Wren, who has lived in this village since before the register entry was made, who served tea at Blackthorn Hall, and listened without appearing to listen, and who has said nothing on the subject of the register beyond the minimum that politeness requires. We found Mrs. Wren that afternoon at the rectory, where she had continued in her duties with the stoical efficiency of a woman who understands that grief is best managed through occupation. She was a handsome woman of 60 or thereabouts, grey-haired and composed, hands that spoke of practical life, and eyes that, on close observation, were doing rather more work than the rest of her expression. Holmes addressed her without preamble. "Mrs. Wren, I believe you were acquainted with a young woman who lived in this parish in the late 1870s. Her name was Eleanor Vane." The effect was not dramatic. Mrs. Wren did not start or pale, but she set down the cloth she was carrying with a deliberateness that was its own kind of answer. And when she looked at Holmes, it was with the expression of a person who has been expecting a particular knock at the door for a very long time, and surprised only that the wait is over. "I knew her," she said. "You were close to her." "I was her companion, in a manner of speaking. She was in service at the Hall. I was living in the village then, my husband still alive. We were friends." She paused. "She was a gentle creature, not worldly, not equipped for what happened to her. And you stood as sponsor at the baptism of her child." Pause that followed was of a different quality from the others, not reluctance. "Precisely. the hesitation of a person deciding how much honesty the moment requires. "I did," she said at last. "The ink of that entry," said Holmes quietly, "is at least 30 years old. The acid applied to remove it is perhaps 3 weeks old." "You did not apply the acid, Mrs. Wren." She looked at him. No, but you knew the entry was gone before Reverend Hale announced the discovery." Her hands, resting on the table before her, tightened briefly. "I noticed it when I was in the vestry one afternoon in October." I said nothing. "Because you were relieved to find it gone?" Another silence, and within it something gave way. Not collapsed, but settled, like a stone that has been balanced on an edge and finally comes to rest upon its flat side. "Because I was afraid," she said. "Not of the erasure. Of whoever had done it, and why they had felt it necessary to do it now, after all these years." Holmes thanked her with a gentleness I was glad to hear in him, and we left her to her duties. On the walk back to the rectory, he was quiet for some time. "She is not the murderer," he said, though confirming a point he had already settled to his own satisfaction. "Her fear is genuine, and it runs in the right direction, outward, toward some other agency, not inward toward guilt. But she knows more than she has told us, and she is protecting someone, even now." He glanced at the hall, just visible above the beeches. "The question is whether she is protecting the living or the memory of the dead." As Holmes sat filling pages in his notebook, and I attempted without notable success to read by the rectory fire, we heard from the housekeeper that the library at Blackthorn Hall had, some hours previously, been disturbed by an apparent attempt to kindle a fire in the grate, with a quantity of old correspondence. Attempt had been abandoned before it achieved its purpose. The correspondence had not been destroyed. Holmes closed his notebook. Then, "We must examine that correspondence before whoever left it decides to be more thorough," said he, rising from the table with an alacrity that suggested the evening had, and taken, from his perspective, a thoroughly satisfactory turn. Chapter 5. The Governess of 1878. Miss Clara Brentwood received us in the library at 8:30 that evening, with an expression suggesting she had been expecting us, or someone very like us, and had spent the intervening hours deciding how to conduct herself when we arrived. The room was long and low-ceilinged, lined on 3 sides with books of the serious undecorative sort that are actually read, and at the far end a fire burned in the grate with rather more energy than the season strictly required. The smell of old smoke was faintly present beneath the wood and resin of the burning logs. Holmes noted the grate without appearing to notice it, which is a distinction I have learned, over the years, to draw with care. Miss Brentwood indicated the correspondence herself, before Holmes had spoken a word about it. It lay in an untidy heap upon a side table beside the cold secondary fireplace at the room's northern end, bundled collection of letters in their original envelopes, secured at one time by a ribbon that had been unfastened and not rebound, and accompanied by 2 loose sheets of a different character which had the look of something copied out rather than originally composed. "My father asked that these be burned," she said. "I could not do it." Holmes looked at her steadily. "Yesterday evening, after you had spoken with Mrs. Wren. He did not tell me what they contained. I believe he assumed I did not know. I have known for rather longer than he suspects." "Known what, Miss Brentwood?" "That my father had a son," she said. "Before my mother, before this house was his in anything more than expectation. A son he never publicly acknowledged." Fire shifted in the grate behind her, and the room was very quiet. Holmes asked no further questions of her that evening, beyond the one matter of practical importance, whether anyone else had been present when Sir Lionel requested the destruction of the letters, and whether she knew if the request had been made before or after the murder of Reverend Hale. To both she gave clear, unambiguous answers. She had been alone with her father, and the request had come. The morning after the body was discovered, not before. Holmes thanked her, took possession of the correspondence with her consent, and we returned to the rectory through the cold dark of the grounds. The letters, spread across the rectory table under the full glare of Holmes's lamp, were the work of 2 hands. The first feminine in character, small and carefully formed, belonged to a writer who had been educated above her station and who composed her sentences with the consideration of someone unaccustomed to expressing intimate feeling on paper. There were 11 of these letters, addressed to no name, merely my dearest, and signed always with the single initial E. The second hand, bolder and less studied, appeared only in brief accompanying notes. 3 in total, each declining in different degrees of gentle firmness. Some request the letters themselves made clear without requiring a direct statement. The picture that emerged was not unfamiliar in its broad outline, though its particulars were rendered painful by the evident sincerity of the feminine correspondent. A young woman of modest position, deeply attached to a man of greater social standing, writing through the middle months of 1877 and into the spring of 1878, first with happiness, then with anxiety, then with something approaching quiet desperation, not once with anger. That restraint, I thought, was its own kind of portrait. "Eleanor Vane," said Holmes, setting down the last of the 11 letters. "The hand matches the period. The emotional intelligence is considerable." He was quiet for a moment. "She asks, in the final letter, only that the child be given a name. Not his name, not a public acknowledgement, merely the right to exist on paper without shame. She refers to Mrs. Wren as the one person she trusts." He turned the letter over and examined the postmark. This was sent from a coaching inn near Guildford, 2 months after the baptism date in the register. She had already left the village by then, left or been sent. The distinction matters, though not for our immediate purpose. He separated the 2 copied sheets from the pile and examined them under the lamp. "These are different. These are not personal correspondence." They were, as I now saw clearly, extracts, copied in a third hand, angular and masculine, and not native to the originals. From what appeared to be a legal document of some kind, the language was formal and densely constructed, and my understanding of such matters is limited enough that I read them twice without grasping the whole of it. Holmes read them once, set them down, and sat back with his fingers pressed together and his eyes on the middle distance. "A codicil," he said, "or rather, notes toward a codicil, copied from a draft that was ultimately not executed. Sir Lionel, some point in the late 1880s. Observe the style of the handwriting, the character of the phrasing. Contemplated an amendment to his will that would have made private provision for an unnamed individual. Described as a natural issue of his own body. The codicil was never completed, but someone made a copy of the draft and has kept it. Who copied it? That is the first question. The second is who, besides Sir Lionel, knew of its existence. Holmes picked up the sheet again. Solicitor would have prepared the draft. The family solicitor in the natural course of affairs. He looked at me with the particular quality of attention he brings to a point he wishes to establish without stating directly. "Mowbray," I said. Mowbray has been in Sir Lionel's service for a decade, but this draft was made 20 or more years ago, which means it predates him. There was a solicitor before Mowbray. Mr. Hartley, according to the county directory, retired some 12 years ago, and whose papers would have passed to his successor. He set the sheet down with the precise care of a man handling something whose value he has accurately assessed. We shall want to speak with Mowbray about those inherited papers. But before we could turn our attention to that line of inquiry, a second matter demanded it. Late the following morning, as Holmes and I were preparing to call upon the solicitor at his office in the market town, arrived at the rectory, in a state of contained but unmistakable satisfaction. He had found, in the course of his investigations, that Mowbray had visited the church on the evening of Reverend Hale's murder. A farm labourer, walking home past the churchyard, had observed a figure he identified, under questioning, answering to Mowbray's description, a tall man in a dark overcoat, entering through the lich gate at approximately 9 o'clock. Mowbray had claimed to have been at his office until that hour, and his office was less than a mile from the church. Furthermore, Lestrade had established that Mowbray's debts were considerably more serious than village gossip had suggested, and that he had, within the past 6 months, made inquiries, discreet but traceable, into the extent of the Brentwood estate and the terms of Sir Lionel's will. "There it is," said Lestrade, with the moderate triumph of a man who expected no less. He was there. He had reason. We have a button from his overcoat, found against the vestry wall, and a witness who puts him at the scene. He looked at Holmes with the expectant air of a craftsman, inviting admiration of a completed piece of work. Well, Holmes was examining the window of the rectory parlour with apparent absorption. "I wonder," said he, "whether you have established how Mowbray entered the vestry." Lestrade indicated that the lich gate had been open. "The vestry," Holmes said, patiently. "Not the churchyard. The vestry door was locked from within when Tupper discovered the body. The church's main door, which was also the vestry's only practical access at that hour, was similarly locked. The key was upon Reverend Hale's person. He turned from the window. I do not suggest Mowbray is innocent of all connection to this affair. I suggest that a man who cannot have entered the room cannot have committed the crime within it." Lestrade's expression underwent a series of careful revisions. Holmes picked up his coat from the chair. "Come, Watson, I think Mr. Mowbray will be considerably more useful to us as a frightened witness than as a wrongly accused man." He paused at the door. "Conceit. He has done an excellent job of appearing guilty. In that, at least, he has shown more enterprise than I should have expected." Chapter 6. A Legacy of Silence. Adrian Mowbray's office occupied the upper floor of a narrow Georgian building in the market town's principal street, reached by a staircase, whose boards announced every visitor with a thoroughness that no amount of carpet could entirely subdue. The solicitor was at his desk when we arrived, and the degree to which he was not surprised to see us told its own small story. He had been expecting a reckoning of some kind, and the only question in his expressions was of which variety this particular one would prove to be. He was a man, I thought, in the grip of that particular exhaustion which descends when the effort of concealment has gone on longer than the concealer anticipated. The professional surface remained. He gestured us to chairs, offered nothing by way of refreshment, folded his hands upon his desk, with the studied neutrality of a man used to sitting across from anxiety rather than embodying it. But the surface was thin that morning, and Holmes was not the sort to mistake it for substance. "Mister," said Holmes, without preliminary, "you were at the church on the night of Reverend Hale's death. I should like you to tell me the truth about it. Because the truth, whatever its complications, is considerably more useful to your present situation than the version you have been offering Inspector Lestrade." Mowbray looked from Holmes to me and back, and then, with the expression of a man setting down a weight he has carried at considerable personal cost, he told us. He had gone to the church, he said, not to meet Reverend Hale, but to retrieve something he believed was stored among the vestry, records. A copy of the draft codicil which he had discovered, on inheriting Mr. Hartley's papers 6 months previously. He had said nothing of it to anyone, recognising immediately that its existence placed him in an impossible position. As Sir Lionel's solicitor, he was obligated to his client's interests. As a man who had borrowed privately against expectations from the estate, he was acutely aware that the codicil's subject, whoever that might be, represented a potential claim upon the very resources from which he hoped to cover his losses. His visit to the church had been an attempt to determine whether Reverend Hale possessed any corroborating material from the parish records that might give the draft codicil legal weight. "You did not speak to Reverend Hale that evening," Holmes said. "Church was dark when I arrived. The lich gate was open, which struck me as unusual at that hour, past, but I assumed the rector had simply forgotten to secure it. I walked to the church door and found it locked. I stood at the gate for perhaps 10 minutes and then left." He paused. "I did not know, until the following morning, what had happened inside, and the button found at the vestry wall." Mowbray's expression shifted with the particular discomfort of a man recalling a separate embarrassment of the church. "I had some notion of trying the vestry window. The button must have caught on the wall then." Looked at his desk. "I am not proud of any portion of this." Holmes regarded him for a moment with the dispassionate attention of a naturalist, correctly identified a specimen, and is now confirming the details. "The draft codicil," he said. "You have it with you, or nearby?" It was not a question. Mowbray opened the lower drawer of his desk and produced a folded document which he placed before Holmes without further prompting. Holmes read it in its entirety. It was 3 pages, densely written, and I watched his expression for the small signals that attend significant discovery. There was one, brief and quickly controlled, near the middle of the second page. He folded the document, placed it in his breast pocket, thanked Mowbray with a courtesy whose warmth was calibrated precisely to the solicitor's diminished dignity, and we descended the announcing staircase to the street. I waited until we had turned the corner. "Well," I asked. "Codicil draft names no individual directly," Holmes said, walking at a pace that suggested he was composing his thoughts rather than hurrying toward a destination. "It was never completed, but it refers to inquiries Sir Lionel instructed Mr. Hartley to undertake. Inquiries directed toward locating an individual who had been, as the document phrases it, placed in a situation abroad at the age of approximately 2 years. He paused at the corner of the street and looked across toward the square without seeing it. Placed abroad at 2 years of age. In approximately 1880. The arithmetic required no elaboration. We returned to Blackthorn Hall that afternoon, and asked to speak with Sir Lionel alone. Brentwood withdrew, with a composure that I was beginning to understand was not coldness, but its exact opposite. A warmth so habitual and so threatened that it required the appearance of coolness to survive. Holmes had asked her, as she left, one quiet question Had Captain Forsyth been known to her father before his arrival in the district, or had the connection been formed here? She had paused, hand on the doorframe, and said that Forsyth had presented himself at the hall with a letter of introduction from a military acquaintance of Sir Lionel's, whose name she could provide if it was wanted. Holmes thanked her and said it was wanted very much. Sir Lionel received us in his study, a room so thoroughly expressive of its occupant's character that it seemed almost biographical. The regimental prints, the worn leather portrait above the mantel of a woman whose features bore a clear though gentle resemblance to Clara's, and whose expression carried something of the same guarded warmth. Holmes sat across from the old man and spoke quietly and directly, none of the indirection he employs when he wishes to extract information from someone disinclined to give it. There was, I thought, deliberate respect in his manner, the acknowledgement of an old grief that deserved to be addressed as such, rather than treated as evidence. Sir Lionel, for his part, listened to Holmes lay out the reconstruction of events without interruption. When Holmes had finished, the old man was quiet for a long time. The fire in the study burned steadily. Outside, the pale afternoon light moved across the frost-bleached lawn. "Was a coward," Sir Lionel said last. His voice had the careful steadiness of a man measuring each word against the limits of his strength. "She was a good woman, better than the situation I placed her in. I told myself I was protecting her reputation by keeping the matter quiet. Protecting myself." He stopped. "She died, did she not?" "I was told she died. Within 18 months of leaving this parish," said gently. "The child survived." Sir Lionel closed his eyes briefly. "I engaged Hartley to make inquiries after some years. Thought. I do not know what I thought, that I might do something at a distance. He reported that the child had been placed with a respectable family and was well. I left it there. I was ashamed to do more, and ashamed to do less, and in that fashion 30 years passed." He opened his eyes and looked at Holmes with the direct, exhausted honesty of a man beyond the ordinary calculations of pride. "Reverend Hale came to me 3 weeks ago. He told me he had found the baptismal entry while reorganizing the archives, and that he believed he had identified the child. The man, by now, from other material he had encountered. He asked my permission to speak to Clara. He felt she had a right to know. And you refused. I told him I needed time. He was patient. He was a good man." The old hands on the arms of the chair tightened briefly. "He was a better man than I ever was." Holmes rose and stood at the window for a moment, his back to the room. Paused. When he turned, his voice was not without feeling, but it was controlled and precise. "Mrs. Wren," he said, "told me that her loyalty to Eleanor Vane was the reason she assisted in the concealment at the time. I believe her. I also believe she has since transferred that loyalty to the memory of Eleanor, which is a somewhat different thing, and has led her to protect a person she perhaps ought not to protect." He looked at Sir Lionel steadily. "When Captain Forsyth presented himself at this house, did you recognise in him anything of Eleanor Vane?" The silence that followed was of a different quality from those that had preceded it. It was the silence of a man arriving, at the end of a very long journey, at a place he has known all along was his destination. "There are mornings," said Sir Lionel softly, "when I look at him and see her eyes." Holmes said nothing, but I saw in his expression, as he turned from the window, something which I can only describe as the specific sorrow of a man who has uncovered the truth, and finds no satisfaction in it whatsoever. Chapter 7. The convenient theory. There is a particular stage in every investigation at which the evidence, having accumulated with obliging abundance, arranges itself into a narrative so coherent and so satisfying that only the most disciplined intelligence resists the temptation to call the matter resolved. I have witnessed this stage many times in Holmes's company, and I have learned perfectly to distrust it. The very completeness of a too early solution is its own warning sign. In the natural world, things which look precisely like what they are tend to be something else entirely. I confess, however, that on the morning following our interview with Sir Lionel, even I found the case against Mowbray acquiring a renewed and almost irresistible gravity. Lestrade presented his accumulated evidence at the rectory table with the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman unveiling a finished commission. He had spent the previous day with thoroughness and considerable industry, and what he laid before us was, taken as a whole, formidable. Witness who had seen Mowbray at the churchyard gate had been re-interviewed and had confirmed both the time and the identification with greater confidence than before. A search of Mowbray's office, conducted, I gathered, somewhat more expedition than strict legal courtesy required, had produced correspondence demonstrating that the solicitor had, in the weeks preceding the murder, written twice to a firm of London inquiry agents asking for information regarding the legitimacy of inheritance, claims arising from natural issue in cases where acknowledgment had been formally withheld. His debts, now fully enumerated, exceeded £3,000, with principal creditors in Bristol and London, who had signalled their impatience in terms that left no comfortable interpretation. And then there was the button. Lestrade laid it on the table with the mild ceremony of a man who understands that small things sometimes carry the largest weight. It was a plain brass button, stamped with an anchor motif, the variety used on heavy overcoats of the better commercial sort. An identical button remained on the coat Mowbray had worn when Lestrade called upon him that same morning. "He was there," said Lestrade. "He had knowledge of the register's significance. He had direct financial motivation to prevent any legitimate claim on the estate, quarrelled with Hale. Only days before the death, the innkeeper and 2 customers confirm it. And he lied about his whereabouts. He sat back with the measured confidence of a man who considers the remaining work to be administrative in character. I intend to bring him in this afternoon." I looked at Holmes. Holmes was doing what he occasionally does in the presence of other people's certainties. He was examining his fingernails. It is a habit that those who do not know him interpret as inattention. Those who do know him understand it as the outward expression of an inward effort to be patient with the world. "Before you do," said Holmes, "I should like to show you something." He led us back to the church for the 3rd time since our arrival in Blackthorn Vale. The morning was sharply cold, the sky low and featureless, and our breath went before us in small white clouds as we crossed the churchyard. Inside, Holmes directed Lestrade's attention not to the vestry itself, but to the approach to it. The narrow passage between the north transept wall and the choir stalls, which gave the only internal access to the vestry door. The vestry door, Holmes said, was locked from within when the body was found. The lock is a simple iron sliding bolt. Here, he indicated it. From the inside, it requires only the turning of a thumb piece. From the outside, cannot be operated by any means. The key to the church's main entrance was on the rector's body, and has not left police custody since the discovery. I put it to you, Lestrade, that a man who was outside the locked church door at 9 o'clock in the evening cannot have been inside the mild, locked vestry at the time of the murder. Lestrade expression moved through several careful revisions, as it had done on the occasion of Holmes's earlier observation on this point. He could have been admitted by Hale himself. They could have quarrelled. And then Hale locked the door from within after Mowbray left. Holmes shook his head, not unkindly. The bolt was drawn from inside. The body was found from outside when the main door was opened with the rector's own key in the morning. The vestry door remained bolted until Tupper forced it. He permitted Lestrade a moment with this. I am not suggesting Mowbray is a blameless figure in this affair. His behaviour has been dishonest and his judgment has been wretched, but a man cannot bolt a door from inside a room he has already departed. We returned to the rectory in a silence that was, on Lestrade's part, meditative, and on Holmes's respectful of that meditation. It was during that same afternoon tune that Captain Forsyth called at the rectory with the expressed purpose of learning whether any progress had been made. He was as ever, large and assured in the doorway, the cold air coming in about him, his colour high, and his eyes moving with what I had come to recognise as the restlessness of a man perpetually monitoring a situation for signs of change. He had called twice previously since the murder, once on the morning of the discovery, and once the evening of Lestrade's arrival, and each visit had been characterised by this same quality of concentrated attention, masquerading as general concern. Holmes received him in the parlour, and was, in the most technical sense, entirely forthcoming. He told Forsyth that Lestrade was building a case, that evidence had been gathered, and that he expected the matter to resolve itself within the next few days. He offered nothing specific, and Forsyth, I noticed, asked nothing specific. He asked instead about timelines, about what could be proven, about whether old documents had the standing in law that newer correspondence possessed. Each question had the shape of idle curiosity and the weight of something rather more pointed. Holmes answered each in turn with an amiable vagueness. The conversation moved across the surface of the matter like a stone skipping water, touching nothing deeply. After Forsyth left Pook's, Holmes stood at the window, watching the captain's retreating figure cross the lane toward the hall. "He is trying to determine," said Holmes, "whether the case against Mowbray is sufficiently advanced to hold. He has been its most vocal supporter from the beginning, which I attributed initially to the natural impulse of a guilty man to encourage attention toward an innocent one. I am now less certain that Mowbray's innocence of the murder is something Forsyth knows with any certainty. He may believe Mowbray killed Hale. He may even hope it. And if the case against Mowbray collapses, then the investigation has no obvious direction but one, and he will know it." Holmes turned from the window. "He has been in this house, in this district, for 8 months, Watson, long enough to have made himself indispensable to Sir Lionel's affections and to Clara Brentwood's domestic arrangements, long enough to have examined the church at leisure." He moved to the fire, his hands held out to the warmth, in a gesture that was the closest I had seen him come that day to visible unease. And he came with a letter of introduction. Miss Brentwood mentioned it. She provided the name, military acquaintance who furnished the introduction. He looked at me. "I telegraphed this morning." The reply arrived an hour ago, produced it from his pocket, and held it without opening it. Major Gerald Forsyth, retired of Cheltenham, states that he furnished a letter of introduction at the request of a Julian Forsyth, whom he knew in the capacity of a brief professional acquaintance in Bombay, but that he has known the man for less than 18 months, and can vouch for his personal character only to a limited degree. He replaced the telegram. The name Forsyth Watson is the captain's surname, as it appears in every document he has produced. His military papers, correspondence, his introduction. Consistent, official, and entirely unremarkable. He was quiet for a moment, yet a surname that was formally adopted in adulthood is not generally adopted from thin air. It is borrowed, sometimes from a place, sometimes from a benefactor. His gaze returned to the window and the empty lane beyond it. Sometimes from the person who arranged one's removal to a life abroad, at the age of 2. Under a name that was not one's own, I absorbed this in silence. Hartley, I said at last, the solicitor who handled the original arrangements. Holmes turned and looked at me, with the particular, approving attention he gives when the correct inference arrives from an unexpected direction. Mr. James Forsyth Hartley, he said quietly, late of this county, and of the Brentwood family's legal affairs for 31 years. Fire ticked behind us, and outside the window, the bare beaches of Blackmore Hall moved against the failing afternoon sky with a sound like something being slowly, methodically erased. Chapter 8. Holmes tests the impossible. Holmes was not a man who slept well in the country. He found in rural silence not the restorative peace that others sought there, but an absence of that perpetual metropolitan stimulation upon which his nervous system appeared to depend as a furnace depends upon its fuel. I had observed, across the preceding days, the slight but familiar signs of a mind running at an intensity the body could not comfortably sustain. The lamp burning past 2 in the morning. The cold pipe left unfilled on the mantelpiece. The breakfast untouched until I remarked upon it. By the morning after his disclosure about the Hartley name, however, something had changed. He came downstairs at 7, with the particular briskness of a man whose night has been spent not in sleep but in productive wakefulness, and who has emerged from it with everything in its proper order. He said, over the 1 cup of tea he would consent to drink, that he wished to return to the church before anyone else was about. We went in the early light, crossing the frozen grass of the churchyard, with our collars turned and our breath rising, and Holmes let us in with the vestry key, which Lestrade had entrusted to him the previous afternoon, with rather less ceremony than the gesture deserved. Inside, the cold was of the particular concentrated variety that old stone accumulates overnight, and our footsteps raised small echoes from the flagging. Holmes went immediately to the vestry window. It was a modest aperture set high in the north wall, perhaps 18 inches in width and somewhat less in height, glazed with a single pane, and secured by an iron latch of the most ordinary pattern. A flat bar pivoting on a central pin, dropping by gravity into a staple fixed to the frame. From inside the room it could be raised by hand without difficulty. From outside, without access to the latch, it appeared to offer no method of operation whatsoever. Holmes examined the frame with his lens for 3 full minutes, working from the lower left corner to the upper right, with the systematic patience of a scholar reading marginalia. Then he straightened, took from his coat pocket a length of stiff wire no longer than a pencil, and asked me to go outside and stand below the window. I did as I was asked. The window was perhaps 8 feet from the ground on the exterior wall, and above me I could see the glass, and, faintly, the silhouette of the iron latch within. "Watch the latch," Holmes called from inside. I watched. For perhaps 10 seconds nothing occurred. Then the left-hand edge of the frame, where the wood had warped perceptibly from the weather of many winters. A thin gap was visible, not large, not deliberately made, but sufficient. The wire appeared in that gap, angled upward, with two small, precise movements raised the latch from its staple. The window swung outward on its hinges by an inch, and stopped. Holmes appeared at the rectory door a moment later and came round to join me. "The warp is old," he said, examining the exterior frame. 10 years at least, perhaps more. It would not be visible to a casual inspection, and it would certainly not be noticed by someone who had never thought to look for it. He measured the gap with his fingers, to someone who had spent time in this building. Over a period of months, the specific purpose of understanding its physical character. He could open it from outside, I said. Enter through the window, conduct the meeting, leave the same way, and pull the window shut behind him. The latch would fall by gravity back into the staple, leaving the vestry apparently sealed from within. Holmes nodded, his gaze moving upward to the gap, with the expression of a man confirming an answer he has already worked through to his satisfaction. The method requires a degree of agility that a man of Mowbray's age and sedentary profession would find taxing, but which a man who has spent 20 years in active military service would consider unremarkable. He turned from the window. "There is one further thing I wish to confirm. Come." We went not back into the church, but round to the eastern end of Blackthorn Hall's conservatory, where Holmes paused on the first afternoon with the close attention. I had not, at that point, fully understood. Conservatory ran along the hall's east wing, a long glazed structure whose interior was visible from where we stood. Ferns and potted palms pressed against the glass, and along the interior shelf, a row of terracotta pots whose deep reddish clay I recognized at once. Holmes crouched at the base of the conservatory's exterior door and examined the threshold with his lens. Then the path of flagstones that led from the conservatory's eastern end, through the kitchen garden, through a gap in the garden wall, and continued as a narrow track between the wall and the churchyard boundary, before connecting, by a short traverse of grass, to the vestry's north exterior wall. The path between the two buildings, I realised, was less than 40 yards. "The clay traces in the vestry," I said, "were not tracked in on the soles of boots from any outdoor path, because there is no clay soil on any outdoor path between here and the vestry. They were carried on the inside of a boot that had stood on the conservatory floor, which is laid with the same terracotta tile and bounded by the same potted soil. He stood, a man accustomed to using this private route between the hall and the church, which several of the household have used, Reverend Hale informed me in our first conversation, as a convenient shortcut to Sunday services. Would have no reason to notice the trace he was carrying until it was too late to matter. We walked the 40 yards ourselves in silence. At the vestry wall, Holmes examined the ground beneath the window with the final exactitude of a man closing the last account. "Two faint depressions in the frost," he said, indicating marks beside the wall that I should have taken for nothing in particular. "A man standing here, leaning inward through the window. He wore boots with a broad square toe, military pattern. He stepped back. We have the method, Watson. We have the physical chain from the hall to the vestry. What we do not yet have, in any form that Lestrade can use, is the evidence that places Forsyth specifically at this window, rather than any other member of the household." We returned to the rectory, and Holmes spent the next 2 hours at the table with Forsyth's military papers, obtained the previous day through a telegraphic request to the War Office, spread before him alongside the few personal documents. Forsyth had produced at various points during the investigation. He worked in silence, comparing dates, cross-referencing postings, with the sparse public record of a man whose history, prior to his commission, thinned to the point of transparency. The commission itself had been granted in 1893, when Forsyth would have been, by Holmes's calculation, approximately 15 years into an adult life that appeared to have begun without institutional record, before the commission a scant trail. A period in Cape Town, a brief reference in a shipping manifest, a name on a passenger list departing Southampton in the autumn of 1889, and before that, nothing. Personal history of a man who had not existed officially until he chose to. Lestrade arrived at noon, and found Holmes seated with his notes before him and an expression which the inspector, to his credit, now recognised as significant. "You are about to tell me that Mowbray didn't do it," said Lestrade, without particular rancour. "I am about to tell you considerably more than that," said Holmes. "I am going to demonstrate to you the method of entry, account for the clay traces, explain the significance of a borrowed surname, and show you that the military records of Captain Julian Forsyth contain a gap of 9 years for which no service record, no civilian address, and no document of any institutional character whatsoever can be produced." He paused, after which, "I propose to invite the captain to join us for what I suspect will be the most consequential conversation this house has contained in 30 years. One question," he said, with the earnest expression of a professional man still trying to keep his footing. "Forsyth is who you say he is, the illegitimate son, grown up and returned. Why, in God's name, did he kill the rector? Hale could only have helped his claim, surely." Holmes looked at him with the patient attention of a teacher who has arrived at the lesson he has been building toward. "That," he said quietly, "is precisely the right question, and the answer to it tells us everything about why the crime was committed at all." He folded his notes with deliberate care. It was not committed for gain, Lestrade. It was committed for the oldest and most intractable of motives. He rose from the table. "Shame, Chapter 9. The child in the register. There is a convention in the telling of detective stories. I am aware of it, having read a number of my own accounts in print, with the mild discomfort of a man hearing his voice played back from a gramophone, by which the final revelation arrives in a burst of theatrical energy. All gathered, parties and pointed fingers and guilty men, finally brought to bay before the assembled company. I have never found this convention entirely satisfactory. In my experience, the moment of exposure carries with it something quieter and considerably more painful than drama. What I witnessed in the drawing-room of Blackthorn Hall on the afternoon of our 5th day in Sussex was, in its outward form, exactly such a gathering. In its inner character, it was something rather different. Holmes had asked Miss Clara Brentwood to arrange it. He had spoken with her privately that morning for 20 minutes, and I did not know what had passed between them until afterward, but she had emerged from the conversation with a stillness about her face that suggested she had been told something she had, in some part of herself, already known, and had been waiting for someone to confirm. She made the necessary arrangements without question, and if her hands were not entirely steady as she poured tea at 4 o'clock, she gave no other outward sign of what the next hour was to contain. Lestrade took a position near the door, with the unobtrusiveness of a large man making a sincere effort. Sir Lionel sat in his customary chair beside the fire, his manservant standing behind him, the old man's face had the quality of ancient parchment, fragile, exhausted, and somehow still intact. Mowbray occupied a chair at the room's periphery, his presence there a concession to Holmes's insistence that a witness to the legal dimensions of the affair was warranted. Mrs. Wren stood near the window. She had come without being summoned, which told its own story. Captain Forsyth arrived last. As though by instinct he understood that entering first would surrender some advantage he still believed he possessed. He looked about the assembled room with an expression of controlled puzzlement, which was, I noted, considerably more controlled than puzzled. Holmes stood before the cold secondary fireplace with his hands behind him and began, not with accusation, but with the history. He told it plainly and without embellishment. Eleanor Vane, the governess, employed at Blackthorn Hall in the mid-1870s, attachment to a man of the house. The child born in the early weeks of 1878, baptised at St. Michael's on the 14th of March, and recorded in the parish register with Mrs. Edith Wren as sponsor. The mother's departure from the village under arrangements made by the family solicitor, Mr. James Forsyth Hartley. Her death within 2 years in lodgings near Guildford. The child placed with a respectable household abroad, in Cape Town, under the name provided by the solicitor who had managed his removal from England. Holmes paused. Here, the fire shifted. Nobody spoke. Child grew. Holmes continued, as children do, regardless of the circumstances of their beginning. He reached adulthood with fragments of knowledge about his parentage, enough to construct a partial picture, not enough for certainty. The name he carried, Forsyth, was borrowed from the solicitor who had arranged his disappearance, whether as a gift, a marker, private irony, we cannot now determine. He obtained a military commission, served with competence in India and elsewhere, and spent a considerable portion of his adult life in the systematic pursuit of the remaining fragments of his history. Forsyth had not moved. He sat with his large hands resting on his knees and his eyes fixed on Holmes with an expression I found, in that moment, genuinely difficult to read. It was not the expression of a guilty man watching the net close. It was something more complicated than that, a compound of defiance and exhaustion, beneath both, something rawer that I recognized, from long medical experience, the particular anguish of a person confronting a wound they have carried. So long they have ceased to understand it as a wound at all. He came to Blackthorn Vale 8 months ago, Holmes said. He came with a letter of introduction that cost very little to obtain and carried just sufficient weight to open the right door. His purpose was not initially violent. He wished to see the man whose blood he carried, and to determine whether any acknowledgement, any private recognition, might be forthcoming. Holmes glanced at Sir Lionel, briefly and without judgment. That recognition came in its limited fashion. Sir Lionel knew. Sir Lionel, private interview, of which only the two of them can give a full account, acknowledged the relationship without offering to make it public. A sound came from Sir Lionel's chair. Not quite a word, not quite otherwise. The arrangement was, from Forsyth's perspective, both a vindication and a humiliation. Holmes continued. Acknowledged in secret, denied in daylight. A man of 40 told in essence that his existence remained, as it had always been, a matter of private regret rather than public record. He let this rest for a moment. And then Reverend Hale, reorganising the church archives, found the baptismal entry. Here Holmes turned, for the first time, to face Forsyth directly. You had already removed the register entry yourself, some days before Hale announced the discovery to the parish. You knew the entry existed. Mrs. Wren had told you of it, believing, I think, that she was doing you a service by confirming what you already suspected. He glanced at Mrs. Wren, who looked at the floor with the expression of a woman paying a long overdue account. You entered the vestry through the window on the north wall, warped frame you had identified during your months of attending Sunday services by the private path. Erwand, through the conservatory garden. Applied the acid with care and patience. You left without incident. Forsyth said nothing. Something in his posture had shifted. The held quality of it. The effort of containment. What you did not know, Holmes said, was that Hale had discovered the entry before you removed it. He had already made a record of its contents in his private notes. He had already, as you learned when he told you, for he told you, before he told anyone else, formed his intention of speaking to Miss Clara Brentwood about the matter. He felt she had a right to know. He was, as has been said several times in my hearing since I arrived in this village, a good man. Quality of silence in the room had changed. It had the weight of something suspended. You met him in the vestry on the night of the 6th pass. You had asked him to say nothing until you had spoken again. He informed you that he intended to proceed regardless. He was not unkind about it, I think. That was not his nature, but he was resolved. Holmes paused. The blow was not premeditated. I am as certain of that as I am of anything in this case. It was a single act of terror, committed by a man who had spent 40 years constructing a self from almost nothing, who saw that self about to be publicly unmade by an act of well-intentioned exposure. He stopped. That it was unpremeditated does not diminish it. It does, perhaps, explain it. The room was entirely still. It was Forsyth who broke it. He did not rise, and he did not look away from Holmes. When he spoke, his voice was level in the manner of a voice that has had some practice at being level under difficult conditions. He would have told Clara, he said, not as a kindness to me, as a matter of what he called his pastoral obligation. She would have known what I was, what I came from. His jaw tightened fractionally. Spent my whole life being what I came from. I did not come here to be defined by it in front of the only person whose good opinion He stopped. His eyes moved briefly and involuntarily to Clara Brentwood, who sat beside the window with her hands folded in her lap and her gaze directed at some point beyond the glass. She did not look at him. Holmes made a small gesture to Lestrade, crossed the room with the quiet efficiency of a man performing a duty he understands to be necessary, and takes no pleasure in. As Lestrade reached him, Forsyth rose, and in rising seemed to shed the last of whatever performance had sustained him through the foregoing minutes remained. Was simply a large man, visibly tired, standing in a room full of the consequences of a life shaped by a decision he had never been consulted about. Holmes had turned to the window. I stood beside him, and together we looked out at the frozen grounds of Blackthorn Hall. The pale afternoon light was already failing across the lawn. The lawn and the churchyard wall was just visible through the beeches, grey and ancient and impassive. Behind us, Sir Lionel's voice said, very quietly, "Julian." I do not know whether Forsyth heard it. He was already at the door, and Lestrade was at his shoulder, and the moment, whatever it might have contained, closed behind them without being completed. Holmes remained at the window for some time after they had gone. Chapter 10. The Weight of Forgotten Things. We did not leave Blackthorn Vale immediately. There were the practical obligations that attend the resolution of any serious crime. Statements to be given, documents to be signed, machinery of the law, to be set in motion with that combination of thoroughness and patience which Lestrade, whatever his limitations as a theorist, always managed with professional competence. Holmes attended to these requirements with his customary brisk efficiency, and by the following morning the principal business was concluded. We might have departed on the noon train, and I half expected Holmes to propose it. Instead, he appeared at breakfast with the look of a man who has decided, without particular explanation, that he is not yet ready to go. We walked that morning, not with any destination declared, but in the manner of two men who have been much indoors, and find the cold air a relief, close rooms, and difficult conversations. The frost had softened overnight into a grey dampness that lay over the downs like a gauze, and the village, as we passed through it, had the subdued quality of a place still absorbing a shock. Curtains were still. The forge was quiet. A woman at a cottage gate watched us pass and then looked away. Holmes was silent for a considerable distance. This was not, I had long since learned, the silence of a mind at rest. It was the silence of a mind continuing to work on a problem that the technical conclusion of an investigation had not entirely resolved. "You are thinking about Forsyth," I said when we had turned off the lane and were climbing the low ridge above the village. "I am thinking about the register," he replied, which was not the answer I had anticipated. About the nature of what a record is, what it is taken to mean. He walked another dozen paces. "We place a great deal of trust in written documents, Watson. Dates, names, formal notation of events that the participants in those events experienced. In all their disorder and complexity, the register reduces a birth to a line, a life to a margin note. We believe the line because it is written, and we fear its erasure because we have come, over centuries, to treat the written version as more real than the event itself. And yet, in this case, the erasure was what exposed everything. As it generally does, the attempt to remove a thing from the record draws more attention to it than the record ever would have received undisturbed." He paused at the crest of the ridge and looked out over the vale below. The church tower, the hall's chimneys just visible above the beeches, the silver thread of a stream in the middle distance. Forsyth feared the entry not because it constituted legal proof of anything. It did not, in itself, and he was intelligent enough to know it, but because he could not bear the thought of his origin announced, as it were, in the most public document of the community. A parish register is read at weddings, at funerals, by solicitors and genealogists and curious neighbours. The name of an illegitimate child, even after 30 years, retains a social charge that a private acknowledgment from a dying old man does not. He turned from the view. He was not wrong about that. He was wrong in everything he did about it. There was nothing to add to this, and I did not attempt to add anything. We called at Blackthorn Hall that afternoon. Miss Brentwood received us in the same drawing-room where the previous day's events had occurred, host, and the room seemed to me to have undergone some quiet alteration, as rooms sometimes do after the thing they have been waiting to contain has finally happened within them. A weight lifted, and another settled in its place. She was composed, more deeply composed, I thought, than on any previous occasion, in the way that a person is composed when they have passed through the worst of something, and found themselves still standing. She thanked Holmes with a simplicity that carried more genuine weight than formal gratitude would have done, and asked one question only: if Forsyth would be tried for murder or for something lesser, given the circumstances Holmes had described. Holmes answered her honestly, as he always does when honesty is requested by someone capable of receiving it. The circumstances, he said, would be placed before a court. with whatever accuracy the evidence permitted, whether the absence of premeditation would be sufficient to qualify. The verdict was a matter for the law to determine, and, the law being what it is, would not necessarily come to the same conclusion that a reasonable, private individual might reach. He could offer her no comfortable prediction. She nodded, as one nods when told something one already understood. "He came here wanting to be known," she said, after a moment. "Not as an accusation, but as an observation of the particular sadness of the thing. That was all he wanted, in the beginning, to be known by someone who shared his blood." She looked at the fire. "I think he succeeded in the end, though not in the way he intended. We all know him now very thoroughly." Holmes said something quiet in reply, which I did not fully catch, but which drew from Clara Brentwood the only small and fleeting alteration of expression. That, across our entire stay in Blackthorn Vale, I should have called a smile. Sir Lionel did not appear. His manservant communicated, with gentle indirection, that the old man had kept to his room since the previous afternoon, and was not receiving visitors. Holmes left a brief note, unsealed, which the manservant took without reading. I do not know what it contained. Holmes did not tell me, and I did not ask. The weeks that followed brought several pieces of news to Baker Street, arriving in the characteristically uneven rhythm of such things. First was a brief formal notice in the legal columns. Proceedings had been initiated, the charge as Holmes had anticipated. The second, arriving some 6 weeks after our return to London, was a letter from Clara Brentwood, written so consign in the direct and thoughtful hand I had noted on the correspondence she had shown us from the library. Kissed. It informed Holmes that Sir Lionel Brentwood had died peacefully at Blackthorn Hall 3 days before Christmas, with his daughter at his side. She added, in the letter's final paragraph, that her father's revised will, drawn up in the final fortnight of his life, and witnessed by a London solicitor he had engaged specifically for the purpose, included a private bequest to an unnamed individual currently before the courts to be held in trust against the outcome of those proceedings. She did not editorialize upon this fact. She stated it and concluded the letter, which was the correct thing to do. Holmes read the letter twice, set it aside, and said nothing for a long interval. Fire in Baker Street burned steadily, and the sounds of the street below. Wheels on wet cobblestones, a distant cab whistle, the ordinary unremarkable persistence of the city going about its business, came to us, as they always did, continuous and indifferent to whatever we might be thinking. "He made provision," I said. "He always intended to," Holmes replied. That was what the draft codicil represented, an intention that fear prevented him from completing for 30 years. At the end the fear receded, picked up his pipe. "It is a very common pattern, Watson. Men who are unable to perform their obligations, while there is still time to perform, fully very often manage to perform a version of them when time has nearly run out. It is better than nothing, considerably worse than what was owed, and they appear to find it, on the whole, sufficient." He paused. "I confess I find it less so." This was, for Holmes, an unusual admission, and I marked it without comment. We returned to Baker Street and its ordinary commerce of the curious, the desperate, and the merely inconvenient. The case receded into that accumulating archive of human difficulty from which I have drawn these pages, where it sat among its neighbours without particular distinction, another file, another set of notes, another narrative of the persistence with which the past insists upon its presence in the affairs of the living. Yet I found, in the months that followed, that it returned to me, at odd moments, with a tenacity that purely intellectual puzzles do not generally produce, not the locked vestry, nor the warped window frame, nor the borrowed surname and its careful logic, but the image of an old man's hands tightening on the arms of his chair as he said I was a coward, and a woman's deliberate avoidance of a pair of eyes across a drawing room, and a large, exhausted man standing in a doorway, absorbing the word that represented the nearest thing to acknowledgement his father had ever spoken to him, in the presence of another living soul. On a cold January evening, some 2 months after our return, I found Holmes at the Baker Street window, in the attitude he occasionally adopts at the end of a case, whose resolution has not entirely satisfied him, motionless, hands clasped behind him, gaze directed at the gaslit street below, with the unfocused attention of a man looking inward rather than outward. I did not disturb him. After some time he spoke without turning. "There is no document so enduring as human conscience, Watson," he said. "Men may scrape words from paper, but never from the soul." I made no reply. There was none that would have improved upon it. Outside, the winter fog moved slowly along Baker Street, gathering about the lamps and softening every edge. The city, folding itself quietly into the dark in the way it does when it wishes to remind you that its business is very old and will continue long after any particular chapter of it is closed.